Pastor and author Bill Hull said, discipleship isn't just one of the things the church does. It is what the church does. The truth is, although the fellowship that you can get at church can be great, people don't need the church to have fellowship with other people. Right? If we're being honest, although the quality of the Sunday morning experience at a church can be great, people don't need the church to be entertained. And although there are great events at churches that can be wonderful, people don't need the church for great events. The fact is, as good as all of that may be at some churches, all of that can be had in the world as good or better than it can ever be had in the church. At the end of the day, there's only one thing the church can offer people that cannot be found anywhere else. That's the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's the one commodity we have that no one else has. The one distinction that sets us apart from everyone else. That's why Jesus didn't say, go therefore and create safe, comfortable spaces for all the nations. He didn't say, go therefore and entertain all the nations. That's why he didn't say, go therefore and put on great events for all the nations. No, he said, go therefore and make disciples of all nations. Because the only thing that we have to offer people that cannot be had anywhere else is the gospel. Which means making disciples is our only job. It's not only profoundly important that we understand that, but it is equally important that we understand what the making of a disciple actually looks like. Because for a long time in the modern era of the church, much of the church has mistaken discipleship for evangelism, as if those two things are one and the same, but they're not. Of course, you cannot have discipleship without evangelism. But again, Jesus didn't say, go therefore and make converts of all nations. He said, make disciples of all nations, which is one of the reasons we don't see the church in the New Testament treating evangelism the way that we typically do in our churches today, where we learn new programs or methods of presenting the gospel, and then we go out and use those methods or evangelism programs to try and lead people to Christ, which, by the way, isn't necessarily wrong, but it would probably be completely unnecessary if disciples lived today the way they did back then. Because the disciples' lives in the first century were so starkly in contrast with the popular culture that they didn't have to go looking for converts. No, they simply lived like Jesus, which was a radical departure from the way anyone else was living at the time. And as a result, the Lord added to their number day by day those who were being saved, Acts 2:47. Because the people who had grown weary of this world and what it had to offer them, they saw these disciples of Jesus empty of self and yet full of joy, while living such radically different lives than what they could find anywhere else in the world. And it attracted people to the gospel en masse. So they just kept doing it. They just kept planting churches, and everywhere they planted a church, the disciples in that new church just acted like Jesus. And the result was more and more people being attracted to it, and it spread like wildfire. Again, not just evangelism, but true discipleship. It's what Jesus modeled for us in his own life, right? Where he didn't just call people to faith in him, to conversion, but he called people to follow him. That's discipleship, the ongoing, lifelong process of following Jesus day by day, which is a radical and radically different way to live your life than you can find anywhere else. So you understand, disciples aren't just believers, they're followers, right? Jesus didn't say to his disciples, come believe in me, but over and over and over again, he said, come follow me. In other words, come be my disciples. And then after learning how to be disciples, he called them to go and make disciples. And hence the church was born. So it's all about, listen, it's all about making disciples. It always has been, and as long as we're here on this earth, it always will be. And look, the most effective way you will ever make disciples of Jesus Christ is simply by being one. Right? You can tell people what you believe in all day long, and you should. But until they see you living it out in your own life, they won't care what you believe in. That's why only disciples can make disciples. And the good news is, that's our only job. You know, I can almost picture Jesus looking down on his church from heaven with everything we try to do and be for this world, things he never called us to do or be. And I can almost picture him saying, you had one job. Right? Stop trying to do everything you were never meant to do and just go make disciples. That's your only job. Which means, of course, the big question for every disciple of Christ today is, are you making disciples of Christ? Because if you're not, then you're not serving Christ. And listen, the remedy is not a new evangelism program. It's not you having to try and become something you're not, which really is a big part of the problem with Christians today making or not making disciples, because we think making disciples means doing something awkward or unnatural, and so we avoid it. That's not what it is at all. Okay? Making disciples, sure, it requires a lot of courage and a lot of commitment, because you have to live in such a way that people will very naturally either gravitate toward you or run away from you as fast as they can. But it's not about some kind of awkward or unnatural presentation to a stranger. No, it's about living your life in such a radically Christ-like way that when people who are around you, people who you're in relationship with, come and ask you why you are the way that you are, which they will. They will. Then you simply tell them the truth about who Jesus is and what he's done for you. It's as simple as that, and it's actually a very natural part of living a Christ-like life, because it's nothing more than an extension of who you already are as a follower of Christ. And then when people respond favorably to that gospel, when you tell them about Jesus, well, then discipleship continues. But listen, that's not where it begins. Okay? The making of a disciple begins the moment you begin living like Jesus in front of other people. Right? Jesus was discipling those 12 men in the Gospels who followed him long before they ever even fully understood who he was. Long before he ever asked them if they knew who he was, and certainly before they put all their faith and trust in him. And it's the same with you and me today. See, if we want to make disciples of Christ, then we have to model the life of Christ in front of them first, as we're going to see in this story today as we continue working our way through 1 Samuel, where David, who is a forerunner and a foreshadowing of the Christ, even as he's being hunted by King Saul, David begins making disciples, as we'll see, among the most unlikely people. And yet they ultimately go on to become leaders in the kingdom of Israel as they follow David and this life that he models for them. Look, long before they even fully understand what they're following. Okay, so let's pick the story up where we left off last time and see what we can learn from David about making disciples. It's 1 Samuel chapter 22. We're going to pick up where we left off before. We'll begin with the first two verses. 1 Samuel chapter 22, verses 1 and 2. David departed from there and escaped to the cave of Adullam. And when his brothers and all his father's house heard it, they went down there to him. And everyone who was in distress, and everyone who was in debt, and everyone who was bitter in soul gathered to him, and he became commander over them, and there were with him about 400 men. So if you were here last week or watching online, then you know that David has been running for his life from King Saul, who's actively pursuing David, bent on killing him, of course, in order to prevent David from becoming king, even though Saul knows good and well that God has chosen and anointed David for that very purpose. And up to this point, David has been alone, other than a brief stop in Nob, the city where the priests and their families lived, in order to get some provisions for himself. And so after lying to Ahimelech the priest, telling him that he's on this clandestine mission for the king and that he needs food and a weapon, David is then given some bread and a sword, which we're going to come back to. And then he moves on with haste as Saul is hot on his trail, which brings us up to speed in the story today, as David then departs from Nob and escapes to the cave of Adullam. Adullam was in Judah. It's about halfway between Gath and Bethlehem, and it was a Canaanite city in the time of the patriarchs, which you'll find back in Genesis 38:1. But later it was captured by Joshua through the conquest of Canaan, and it was known for this giant hill that was both fortified and also full of deep caves, which provided natural shelter. In fact, the name Adullam in the ancient Hebrew literally means refuge. And not only did David's family follow him there, which we'll talk about next, but also hundreds of these people who were in distress, and everyone who was in debt, and everyone who was bitter in soul gathered to him. Okay, these were the outcasts and malcontents who lived on the ragged edge of society that were flocking to David, a fugitive himself, in the harsh frontier lands of Israel. And out of that raw, unrefined, and unwanted element of society, David discipled and trained one of the most formidable fighting armies this world has ever known. It was a band of brothers who became known as David's mighty men, who would do anything for him, according to 2 Samuel 23. Listen, if you consider David's plight, a man disgraced by the king and in imminent danger, he couldn't go to his house. He couldn't go to his wife. He couldn't go to the palace. He couldn't go to his family. He couldn't go to Samuel. He couldn't go to Jonathan, right? The only place David could go was to a cave, to hide like an animal with one sword and a few loaves of bread. This is a man who can barely provide for himself at this point, let alone hundreds of needy people. And yet here they are, flocking to David in droves, because they recognized that what David had to offer them was infinitely better than what this world had to offer them. And because David accepted people no one else would, he was able to disciple them in ways no one else could. It's the first step in learning to make disciples. You have to be willing to accept the people that God sends to you, whether they fit into your preferred demographic or not. Right? I'm certain David would much rather have had hundreds of well-fed, well-trained, well-armed warriors with really positive attitudes. But that's not what he got. No, instead, God sent him the rejects of society, the anxiety-laden, financially irresponsible, discontented, ill-equipped, and untrained outcasts with a terrible outlook on life. Gee, thanks God. But David accepted them, and because he was willing to do life with these people who were nothing like him, because he accepted them as they were, they paid very close attention to this man that Samuel described as a man after God's own heart, a man who modeled for them what life looks like when you follow God, even through all of his mistakes. And boy, David could make some mistakes. Right? And the result, well, it couldn't have been more dramatic. more profound as they were ultimately transformed into the leaders of the kingdom, because David was willing to look past their rough exterior, their rotten attitudes, and their lack of resources and see the potential that God had put inside of them. And listen, if you want to be a disciple who makes disciples, then you have to be willing to accept the people that God sends to you, the people who are nothing like you, the people who don't have what you have, or know what you know, or act like you act, or think like you think, or vote like you vote, or live like you live. They may be rough. They may be unrefined, ill-equipped, and untrained in how good Christians are supposed to act, whatever that means. But listen, as long as you're looking for the perfect disciple, you'll never make one. Yet I promise you, the moment you open up your heart and your mind to the possibility of discipling whoever God happens to send your way, you will never have to go knocking on doors to try out the new evangelism program in your church ever again, because God will just keep sending people to you until you can't handle anymore. He will. He sent David 400 of them. See, the problem is, we've tried to make discipleship a program instead of making it our way of life. And when we make discipleship a program, then we are choosing who it is we prefer to disciple as we see fit, instead of simply accepting the people God sends to us as He sees fit. And I'm telling you, if you will begin to view your entire life in the context, through the lens of discipleship, the job you have, the neighborhood you live in, the people you hang around with, the ongoing interaction you have with people day after day, day in and day out, if you will begin to view all of that in the context of discipleship, or at least the possibility of discipleship, which again simply begins with the modeling the life of Christ in front of people, right? Once they realize it's not a gimmick, that's actually how you really are, they will start to ask you questions about their life and about your life. They will. And in the beginning, usually they're testing the waters to see whether or not you're going to accept them, to open up yourself to them. And sure enough, the moment you resist engaging in those kinds of conversations with people, the moment you begin to push back on that, they're gone. They may still be around you physically. They may still hang around, but you've lost your opportunity that God has given you to disciple them, because people will close themselves off immediately if you resist them. And yet as soon as you accept people into your life, as soon as you make room in your life for the people God sends you, whether or not they are the people you would have chosen, then you will witness the making of a disciple right before your eyes. And I guarantee you, your life will never be the same again. Bill Hull said, God has not promised to bless our good motives, dreams, and innovation. He's promised to bless His plan. That plan is that disciples make other disciples. Everything else is a sideshow. Let's keep reading, verses 3 through 5. And David went from there to Mizpah of Moab, and he said to the king of Moab, please let my father and my mother stay with you till I know what God will do for me. And he left them with the king of Moab, and they stayed with him all the time that David was in the stronghold. Then the prophet Gad said to David, do not remain in the stronghold. Depart and go into the land of Judah. So David departed, and he went into the forest of Hereth. So eventually David leaves the cave and travels to Moab, because his family, his brothers, and all his father's house have left their homes in Bethlehem to join David. Listen, not because they can't wait to go spend vacation with David in a cave. It's because out of Saul's insatiable hatred for David, his entire family's in danger of violent reprisals by Saul. And so they leave their home to join David. And of course, David realizes after some time living in a cave in the wilderness that his aging parents aren't going to survive there long term. So he leads the congregation of people, including his family, to Moab. This is the sworn, bitter enemies of Israel, right? But he does. He takes them there, first of all, because it's an enemy stronghold that would offer a lot of protection from Saul. And secondly, because David's great-grandmother is Ruth, a Moabite. So David has kin in Moab. So he leads the people there, which in and of itself must have been a very difficult journey, especially for David's parents. It's a descent of about 3,000 feet to the Dead Sea, and then a similar ascent up to the plateau of Moab. So it's a difficult journey to be sure. And yet once they get to Mizpah in Moab, the fortified city of the king of Moab, Mizpah means watchtower, they're accepted there by the king, who agrees to look after David's parents, because as far as the king is concerned, any enemy of Saul is a friend of Moab. And it was working out great for everyone involved until the prophet Gad, he's one of the 400 who came to David in the wilderness. He tells David that he must depart back to the wilderness of Judah, because the Torah clearly prohibited the establishment of friendly treaties with Moabites. You couldn't set yourself up in a situation where you're helping the enemy. It's spelled out in Deuteronomy 23, 2-6. So it was good while it lasted, but now it's time to go. And so David leads the people back to Judah, to the forest of Hereth. It was a known hideout for fugitives west of the Dead Sea, which again is anything but ideal when it comes to caring for all these people, right? His own parents in particular. The stronghold of Mizpah was safe. It was well supplied. It was well defended. Now David's right back in the wilderness trying to scratch out an existence while caring for hundreds of people and his own family. And yet, that's the whole point. David could have easily said to the people who were with him, right? These were people who were already not faithful to King Saul or Israel at this point. David could have easily left them in Moab. It's his golden opportunity to finally be rid of all these people who were most certainly pulling on him, on his ability to even take care of himself, but he didn't get rid of them. He didn't abandon them, because David understood that the Lord had sent these people, and they were therefore his responsibility to look after and disciple. You see, David took responsibility for people no one else would. It's the next step in the making of a disciple, because look, it's one thing to accept someone for who they are, to listen to them and allow them access to your life. It's good. But it's another thing altogether to take responsibility for their well-being, spiritual and otherwise. I'm sure there had to be moments where David thought, great, I not only have to look after myself, but now I have all these needy people to look after too, especially after having to leave behind his life in the royal palace, a life leading Saul's army, a life of privilege and plenty, to now caring for the fringe of society while barely being able to take care of himself. Now, whose life do you think he was modeling? He didn't even know it. But listen, Jesus left his throne in heaven to come down here and care for the fringe of society, the outcast, the people no one else was willing to care for. And here's the deal. He doesn't expect any less from us, right? Because that's what it means to make a disciple. You take responsibility for the spiritual and sometimes physical welfare of that other person. And if you think that will require a ton of personal sacrifice, well, then you're getting the picture, because it will. We often think of the 12 disciples of Jesus as these poor, beleaguered fishermen who just struggled to get by in their impoverished state. And they must have been happy to drop what they were doing and follow Jesus in the hopes of finding a better life. But that's actually not true. Many of them were quite well off businessmen running lucrative family businesses. It's attested to, at least in part in the Gospels, by the fact that they had hired servants working for them when Jesus called them to follow him. And listen, when Jesus called them, these wealthy men dropped those businesses, abandoned their income, their wealth, their security, their comfort, their whole way of life, and they followed him. Now, put yourself in their sandals for a minute. Think about your job, right? Your business, your home, your lifestyle, your whole way of life. If Jesus called you to leave all that behind in order to go and make disciples, would you do it? By the way, it's not about being poor, right? He calls wealthy people to make disciples too. The point is, there's a personal cost associated with making disciples, because you're not just telling people about Jesus, you're showing them who he is in the way you live your life from one day to the next in the context of your relationships with those other people. It is a tremendous responsibility with eternal implications. But that's what David did. In fact, that's what Moses did. That's what Paul did. That's what Peter did. That's what Jesus did. And before you say, well, that's not exactly my calling. Well, you're right. It's not your calling. It's his calling on your life. He's called every single one of us to go into the world and make disciples, which means if you are not actively making disciples of Jesus Christ in your life, then you are not answering his call on your life. I don't know how to say it any clearer. And yet so many Christians lose sight of that. We have this tendency to talk about my calling a lot, or people are constantly asking the question, what's my calling? Or I'm trying to discover my calling in life. Well, it's not your calling that you need to discover. It's his. And it happens to be the same for every single one of us, to go and make disciples. That's your only job. And it's a profound responsibility. And so look, whatever you end up doing in life, if it doesn't involve making disciples, then without question, you have missed your calling. Because we're all called to make disciples of Jesus Christ. There are no exceptions. And so what people are actually looking for when they say they're trying to discover their calling, whether you realize it or not, what people are looking for is not the calling itself, but the way that calling is carried out in their lives. Because look, you can be a preacher, or a doctor, or an electrician, or a wildly successful business owner, or a parent, or student, or an artist, or one of many other things, and very effectively make disciples of Jesus Christ. You can, because the calling is exactly the same. How that calling is realized in your life, well, that's different for everyone. And so the moment Jesus calls you to follow him, you understand that is the moment you have received your life's calling. The moment you become a disciple of Christ is the moment you've received your life's calling to go and make disciples. How you carry out that calling, well, that part is unique to you. And so if you're still searching to fulfill the call of Christ on your life because you're not exactly sure how he intends to do that specifically through you, I'm going to tell you something that will help you discover that specific path to his calling in your life. It's summed up in two words: serving others. It's how David discipled other people and learned how to be a king. It's how Moses learned to lead the people of Israel out of Egypt. It's how Paul learned to plant churches. It's how Peter learned to lead Gentiles to Christ. And it's how Jesus chose to express himself as the King of all kings, by serving other people. And guess what? It's the only way the call of Christ will ever be fulfilled in your life. It's the only way, by serving others as you take responsibility for their welfare, spiritual and otherwise. Because the calling is not about you serving you. It's about you serving Jesus Christ and his church, his people. And look, that's what disciples of Christ are supposed to be known for. We should be famous for the way we serve other people. And I'll just tell you, that requires a lot of maturity. I know, because I lack it often. It requires a lot of maturity and patience and commitment and courage, and at times sacrifice, because look, sometimes the people you serve won't like the way you serve them. Some of you already know that. Sometimes the people you serve, they won't like the way you serve them. Sometimes they'll push back against discipleship. Sometimes they'll push back against you, just like you and I do sometimes with God. But that's what the making of a disciple looks like. Just look at Jesus and his disciples. I mean, how messy was that? But Jesus just kept serving them. He kept discipling them until they got it, and then he sent them out to make more disciples. And so look, if you're serious about wanting to fulfill the call of Christ on your life, and you have yet to discover specifically how you're supposed to do that, then go ahead and simply take on the responsibility of serving God's people somehow, some way, somewhere. And I guarantee you, you will find your purpose. You will begin to make disciples, and you will never want your life to go back to the way it was before ever again. Pastor and author Kevin DeYoung once said, "The one indispensable requirement for producing godly, mature Christians is godly, mature Christians." Let's keep reading, verses 6 through 19. Now Saul heard that David was discovered and the men who were with him. Saul was sitting at Gibeah under the tamarisk tree on the height with his spear in his hand, and all his servants were standing about him. And Saul said to his servants who stood about him, "Hear now, people of Benjamin, will the son of Jesse give every one of you fields and vineyards? Will he make you all commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds?" In other words, will David take care of you the way that I have? That all of you have conspired against me. No one discloses to me when my son makes a covenant with the son of Jesse. None of you is sorry for me or discloses to me that my son has stirred up my servant against me to lie in wait as at this day. And then answered Doeg the Edomite, who stood by the servants of Saul, "I saw the son of Jesse coming to Nob to Ahimelech the son of Ahitub, and he inquired of the Lord for him and gave him provisions and gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine." Then the king sent to summon Ahimelech the priest, the son of Ahitub, and all his father's house, the priests who were at Nob, and all of them came to the king. All of them came. And Saul said, "Hear now, son of Ahitub." And he answered, "Here I am, my lord." And Saul said to him, "Why have you conspired against me, you and the son of Jesse, and that you've given him bread and a sword, and have inquired of God for him, so that he's risen against me to lie in wait as at this day?" He's questioning them about what we studied last week, if you were here, right? And then Ahimelech answers the king, "And who among all your servants is so faithful as David?" That was probably the wrong thing to say. "Who is the king's son-in-law and captain over your bodyguard and honored in your house? Is today the first time that I've inquired of God for him? No. Let not the king impute anything to his servant or to all the house of my father, for your servant has known nothing of all of this, much or little." The king said, "You shall surely die, Ahimelech, you and all your father's house." And the king said to the guard who stood about him, "Turn and kill the priests of the Lord, because their hand is also with David." And they knew that he fled and did not disclose it to me. But the servants of the king would not put out their hand to strike the priests of the Lord. Then the king said to Doeg, "You turn and strike the priests." And Doeg the Edomite was all the more happy to do so. He turned and struck down the priests, and he killed on that day 85 persons who wore the linen ephod. And Nob, the city of the priests, he put to the sword both man and woman, child and infant, ox, donkey, and sheep he put to the sword. Okay, this is the fallout from David's deception of Ahimelech from the last chapter, which we went over in depth last week, so we won't go over that part of the story again now, other than to say that David's behavior in the last chapter plays a significant role in the tragedy that follows here, which, by the way, David recognizes and admits to as much as we'll see. And so Saul is holding court. He's conducting royal business outdoors. It was actually a time-honored tradition at a prominent location, a hilltop, under a tamarisk tree, which was associated with the worship of Yahweh, and with his spear in hand. All of that was meant to convey a sense of authority and dignity when conducting royal affairs at any location outside of the royal court. In other words, the king's pursuit of David is not a hobby for Saul or a side job in his spare time. Now, killing David has become the official business of the government and priority number one for Saul, as we see here as he launches into an official complaint, an official accusation against his own staff. He says, "Hear now, people of Benjamin, will the son of Jesse give every one of you fields and vineyards? Will he make you all commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds, that all of you have conspired against me? No one discloses to me when my son makes a covenant with the son of Jesse. None of you is sorry for me or discloses to me that my son has stirred up my servant against me to lie in wait, as at this day." It sounds to us, when you read it, like Saul is whining here. But what he's saying is actually true. Because the one thing that the king wants accomplished more than anything else in the world is the very thing his own staff is working against him on. They make no attempt to keep him informed about what's happening with David, and they refuse at points along the way, as we've seen here, to even follow Saul's orders. So Saul accuses them of working against him. And their silence speaks volumes. That's where Doeg, the prisoner of war that we were introduced to last week, comes in, because he has nothing to gain by protecting David, but he has potentially a lot to gain by satisfying Saul. So he inserts himself into the conversation, which would normally never be his place, and he tells Saul a part of what happened between David and the priest Ahimelech in the previous chapter. I saw the son of Jesse coming to Nob, to Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, and he inquired of the Lord for him and gave him provisions and gave him the sword of Goliath, the Philistine. That's what I saw. In other words, he tells Saul that Ahimelech helped David by giving him food and weapon, but he conveniently leaves out the part where Ahimelech was literally trembling when David showed up, and that he peppered David with questions because he felt like something was wrong, David being there alone, and the fact that David lied about all of that and more. Right? It would have been abundantly clear to anyone watching, as Doeg was that day, that Ahimelech was only trying to do what was right by God, by Saul, and by David. But of course, Doeg keeps all of that to himself conveniently. And remember, he was a prisoner of war, serving the priesthood against his own will. And so as far as Doeg is concerned, this is revenge. And so Saul calls for the priests from Nob, all of them. And he asked Ahimelech, "Why are you conspiring with David against me?" To which Ahimelech replies with the truth. "I've done nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing out of character for the priesthood. Nothing I shouldn't have done given the information I had at the time. And by the way, Saul, I don't know anything you're talking about. I don't know about any of the trouble with David you're referring to." And all that was true. And yet there in the formal setting of the royal court, after Ahimelech presents a thoughtful and respectful and reasonable defense against Saul's accusations, Saul holds a trial in which he's the prosecutor, judge, and jury, as he declares the entire priesthood led by Ahimelech guilty of a massive conspiracy against him, and he orders their immediate death. And of course, his own servants refused to carry out the death sentence, so Doeg, the traitor, happily does it for them. And yet Saul doesn't stop there, as he marches him right into Nob and kills every single man, woman, child, infant, and animal in the entire city, save one man, the son of Ahimelech, who escapes and runs straight to David. Let's finish the story for today, verse 20 to the end of the chapter. But one of the sons of Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, escaped and fled after David. And Abiathar told David that Saul had killed the priests of the Lord. And David said to Abiathar, "I knew on that day when Doeg the Edomite was there that he would surely tell Saul, 'I have occasioned the death of all the persons of your father's house. Stay with me. Do not be afraid, for he who seeks my life seeks your life. With me you shall be in safekeeping.'" So one man, one of the sons of the priest, escapes the slaughter. He rescues the ephod, by the way, the priestly garment. We learned that in chapter 23. And he runs to David's encampment in the forest of Hereth. And he tells David what happened. You want to talk about a heavy moment. As David is standing there listening from an eyewitness and a son of the priest, that the entire priesthood, his parents, all of the other priests, all their families, all their homes, everything they owned, has been completely destroyed, wiped out, all because Ahimelech gave David some bread and a sword. Bread and a sword that David deceived Ahimelech into giving him. Look, David could have easily sidestepped his part in all of this because Ahimelech was dead along with everyone else. There was no one left who was there to talk about what happened that day except Doeg, who Abiathar had no access to at this point. So he runs to David to tell David about the fact that everyone he loves and cares about has just been brutally murdered. And David, who could have made any number of excuses for what had just happened, instead, he takes full responsibility for what just happened. He says, "I Abiathar, I have occasioned the death of all the persons of your father's house. It's my fault. Can you imagine? What a powerful moment of honesty and agony and forgiveness that must have been between these two men, because in that moment a friendship begins that lasts throughout David's entire reign over Israel, where each of these men were mutually discipled by the other as David was king and Abiathar served as priest. But listen, make no mistake about it, that relationship would never have happened had David not admitted his fault in the slaughter of Abiathar's family and friends. And that's the thing about David. And that guy could mess up as good as anybody. But every time it was pointed out to him, he owned it. He admitted his faults. He took responsibility for the consequences. And because of that honesty and willingness to admit his own faults, he was able to continue to have meaningful influence in so many people's lives. The fact is, David admitted his faults in ways that no one else would. And it drew people to him, not because he was perfect, but because he was honest about his imperfections. And boy, if we couldn't use a dose of this in the body of Christ today. Because listen, the fact that we're all broken people is not the problem. The problem is we don't want to admit that we're broken. We don't want to admit that sometimes we get it wrong, and sometimes when we get it wrong, we hurt other people in the process. And I'll just tell you, the fastest way to drive people away from you is to convince yourself that you're always right. Then you'll never disciple anyone. David could have said to Abiathar, well, you know what, pal, that wasn't my fault. Your dad should have made sure that old Doeg wasn't around first. Or, you know what, everybody knows you can't trust Saul. It's all his fault. And anyway, your father should have known better. But no, David owned it. Instead, he owned up to the worst parts of it. And he didn't stop there, because part of owning up to your own faults is doing something about it. And so after admitting to his part in this tragedy, David immediately addresses the most vulnerable part of Abiathar's life in that moment. Think about it. Abiathar just witnessed his parents and siblings and friends and home and belongings, everything being destroyed brutally by Saul. He's just witnessed it, and now he's running for his life. The overwhelming vulnerability for Abiathar in that moment is fear for his own personal safety. And so what does David do? Right after admitting his own responsibility for what had happened, he says to Abiathar, stay with me. Do not be afraid. For he who seeks my life seeks your life. With me, you will be in safekeeping. David not only accepts responsibility for his own mistakes, but he does something about it. He directly addresses the need that he created in Abiathar's life. And I'm telling you, if we as disciples of Christ will learn to admit our faults one to another, James 5:16, and then do something about it, namely seek forgiveness from one another and then offer to make it right by tangibly helping the people we've hurt, I'm telling you, we will have all the influence in this world we will ever need to make new disciples. You know why? Because nobody does that. Nobody wants to take responsibility for themselves and their own behavior anymore. Which, of course, we should expect from the world, but not from the church. Okay, there's enough pretense and arrogance in this world to go around. We don't need to add to it. And the irony is, people think they'll lose their influence with others by admitting their faults, when actually the opposite is true. It's when we're honest about the fact that sometimes we're wrong, that sometimes we do things that hurt other people, and when you do something to make it right, listen, you will gain more influence in that person's life than you ever could pretending that you're never wrong. Because discipleship requires humility. And if there was ever a time in our lifetime when the world needed a humble, steady, listening church, it is now. Our culture has reached a boiling point. We're living in a moment in time that will be written about in history books. And so look, if it was up to you to script what will be written and remembered about the church at this critical juncture in our history, what would you write? That we yelled the loudest? That we got our point across? That we fought hard against the people we disagreed with? That we got our man in office? Or would you write that the church rose up in the hour of this country's greatest need, and with a steady hand and a humble heart and a quiet spirit, the church did something about it? Would you write that the church hunkered down and survived? Or would you write that the church stood up and spoke up for those who could not stand up or speak up for themselves? Would you write that the church made hollow promises to pray for people in their darkest hour? Or would you write that the church took responsibility for people in their darkest hour? What would you write about the church if it was up to you? Because you know what? It is up to you. Making disciples is up to you. In fact, it's your only job. And it's the only way this world is ever going to change. One disciple of Jesus Christ at a time. Let's pray.